Business Diplomacy Today, the podcast about international relations and geopolitics from a business perspective. We help you anticipate the changing political and societal trends that influence your business.
Welcome. My name is Matthias Catón. I'm your host. Business Diplomacy Today is presented by the German Maritime Centre. To find out more about the centre, go to maritime.centre. You can also find the link in the show notes. Our topic today is subsea cables and the role they play as part of our critical infrastructure. And to speak about that topic, I have two guests. So this is a first for this podcast, the very first time that we have not just one, but two very competent guests. And I'm very happy to have them on the show. And we'll introduce them by alphabetical order of their surname. So I'll start with Jonas Franken. Jonas is a doctoral candidate with PSEC, which is an acronym, and it stands for Science and Technology for Peace and Security Group in the Department of Computer Science at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany. He works at the junction of policy, technology, and international law, and his research examines the resilience of critical information infrastructure on land and at sea. He also studies maritime security and digitalization of critical systems. He holds a BA in politics and law from the University of Münster, which is also in Germany, and holds an MA in international studies and peace and conflict research from Goethe University, Frankfurt, also in Germany, and TU Darmstadt, which I mentioned earlier. He served in the German Navy and has worked in civilian sea rescue. Our second guest is Camino Kavanagh, and she is a visiting senior fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a fellow with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Her work covers technology, international security, conflict, and diplomacy. Today, she focuses on cybersecurity and the security and resilience of subsea infrastructure, the topic that we will be discussing today. She served as an advisor and rapporteur to UN negotiations on cyberspace and international security in 2016 and 2017, and also again from 2019 to 2021. Those works included the open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts. Sounds very important. Over the past decade, she has worked across UN peace and security entities, regional organizations, and national governments. And earlier, she spent more than a decade in conflict settings worldwide, including with UN peacekeeping and political missions. So, as you can already see from the very long bio notes that I used to introduce them, they're both very, very experienced in their field and also abroad. And that is, of course, quite important because in our podcast, what we're trying to do is to put those issues into a broader perspective and look at them in particular from a business perspective. So let's begin with kind of a really basic definition. Obviously, we all know what subsea cables are, more or less. They transport a lot of the data that we rely on, internet connections, such as the one that we're using to record this podcast. And we also have heard that sometimes things go wrong. These cables get severed for reasons that are not entirely clear, maybe due to an accident, maybe also not. So give us an idea, what are we talking about when we're talking about subsea cables? Are those individual cables here and there? Is that something that is laid across the seabed everywhere? How do I have to imagine that if I'm not an expert in that field?
So maybe I can start with the most recent descriptions of what a subsea cable system is. So it's not just the submersed element of the system, the cable itself, strands of fiber optics across. The systems themselves, that submersed element has a very long history. They've moved from the telegraph, the electric telegraph cable systems that often are in the news from an historical perspective in terms of government's capacity to sabotage and tap the systems. I think it was the 1950s onwards, there's the coaxial cable. And then from the 1980s onwards, you have the fiber optic cables. But based on recent descriptions of the systems for policy perspectives, both from the EU perspective, but also the New York Statement on Joint Principles related to the security and resilience of subsea cable systems, their description goes beyond the submersed element to cover the landing points, the cable landing stations, the backhaul, the front haul, and the terrestrial connections, the fleet of cable maintenance and repair ships. What else am I missing? The supply chains. The broader ecosystem is basically what a system from a policy perspective is what we're talking about. And Jonas, do you want to talk about the number of cable systems that there are in action at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at international data cables, there are about 530 systems that are active by now. And if you look at the next 6 or 7 years, that's the horizon for planned cable systems. It's about 70 new cable systems that are in planning on different levels of stages. So some are already in construction, some are only doing desk studies by now.
And some will meet their end of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you talk about the systems, that is a point-to-point connection between country A and country B, let's say, through the Baltic or whatever it may be. Is that what you call a system?
So system can also be a little more complex. So there are many, about half of cables that have just simple point-to-point connections with only 2 landing stations. But globally, there are about 1,600 cable landing stations, and some of the cable systems actually have very many cable landing stations. So landing points and branches make a cable more complex. So you have branching units on the subsea, and that split up the fibers, and some fiber strands take a different path than others. I think the largest cable has about 30 landing stations. So there's a very large difference in the complexity of a cable system and also in the length. So there are some cable systems that connect just domestically small islands to the coastal areas, and also cables crossing whole oceans, trans-Pacific cables running from East Asia to Western Europe. So there's also huge differences there.
Now, these cables, obviously, you normally can't see them, obviously, because they're underwater. So they're not visible to, the public eye for the most part, I assume, maybe with the exception of those landing stations that you can probably see in one way or another somewhere. And it's also part of the infrastructure that we all rely on, obviously, but that people usually only notice or care about when something goes wrong. It's a little bit like with sewage, right? We assume that it just works, but in the moment it doesn't, then we realize, it's actually quite essential. So has something changed in the way this infrastructure is being seen? Because, as you said, it is not a new infrastructure. It has been around in different iterations for a long time. First, as telegraph cables, then for, I guess, voice communication predominantly, then bit by bit, the data communication took the most important role. But has it changed when we come to security assessments? Has something recently changed, or is it just that we're talking about security issues much more than we used to maybe 10 or 15 years ago?
So maybe I'll start. It depends very much, Matthias, on where you're sitting in the world. If you live in Tonga, you're very aware of the systems, because when the sole cable that the country is reliant on is taken out or damaged by a geological event, then you're very aware of the systems. Evidently, that's changing in relation to Tonga now. If you're living in Southeast Asia as well, you're very aware of geological or weather events. And so here in Europe, evidently, I think it was pre-Nord Stream, there were a couple of incidents off the coast of Norway, then Nord Stream happens, and then the series of incidents that have happened in the Baltic Sea. Also, if you're in Ireland, there have been some activity that has hit the news, raising awareness of the infrastructure in that context as well. Same in the UK, in the Shetlands, there were some outages there in 2022 that also raised, I guess, the relevance of the infrastructure. And it's very interesting because prior to that, or even in many meetings that we go to, a lot of people still believe that their internet connectivity comes via satellite, which is very strange. I'm not too sure where that comes from. Probably popular culture. But now that subsea cables are now also featuring in novels and so forth, that may change over time. Jonas, over to you.
Yeah, you actually also mentioned what I wanted to say about the regional differences. So even though here in Europe we have some incidences, they usually do not play out as a disruption of service. Camino mentioned the Shetland Islands. I think this is one of the rare cases where an actual European territory was affected by an internet outage due to subsea cable faults. But in different areas of the world, parts of Eastern Africa, parts of Western Africa, especially in the South Pacific island nations, they are affected directly by a subsea cable fault. They do not have the levels of redundancy that we know and we got used to in Europe. And this is where you can see the differences of threat perceptions and why the topic is raising on the agenda. I think in Europe, most dominantly, I think Nord Stream, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, were a point where much of the attention shifted towards other maritime critical infrastructures as well. And then you had in the fall last year, the Baltic incident. So a row of 3 or 4 incidents with commercial vessels that dragged anchors above subsea cable lines and by some governments got interpreted as attempt of sabotage.
Okay, that was a very carefully worded formulation. Let's maybe get back to that. So I understand, of course, redundancy is one issue, and the more remote and the smaller particular places, whether that be the Shetlands or Togo, no offense to both places, but they're both rather remote and also not very densely populated. So they tend to rely, obviously, on a single point of failure, probably also because of cost reasons that it might not be economically feasible to have a lot of redundancy there. You also mentioned satellites, and indeed, many people think that, cables is old school and the new technology should be wireless, like with phones. We don't use cable-based phones anymore for the most part. And although satellite communication is also on the rise, I understand, and there are even, commercially available services such as Starlink and others that basically are consumer products nowadays, satellites could not handle the communication because of the volume, probably not because the technology is not there, but because it could not handle the volume. Or what is the issue there?
I think there are 2 issues there. On the one hand, it's the bandwidth. So cables just can handle terabits of data, and it's orders of magnitude compared to satellite networks. If you want to have a rough number of a modern cable that's built by now, I think it only takes a bandwidth of 3 cables to have the whole theoretical bandwidth of the whole Starlink network. So it's orders of magnitude by bandwidth, so you couldn't just use or serve whole societal needs of internet demand only by satellite. And the other point is latency. Depending on what satellite service you use, latency can be quite high. So the time a signal just travels back and forth. And if you want to have a live trading, millisecond trading application, or you want to have a gaming stream, whatever, very time-critical services, they just don't work as well over satellites as they do over fiber optic cables.
So in short, we need the cables, we will still need them, and we will probably need more of them because everybody forecasts that the volume of data that we send and receive will probably continue to increase. So how do we best deal with those issues? Let me ask you a question because I don't know. One of these fiber optic subsea cables, how thick are these cables? Is that like a cable that I have for electricity, or is it like 2 meters diameter? How thick are these cables?
Yes, they're usually compared in diameter to a garden hose.
Okay. I can imagine that as if I were to lay my garden hose across the Baltics or even across the Atlantic. Is that how that works? The one thing is the cable, obviously, but is there some protection around it? Yes,
there are different layers of protection, and the protection, I guess, becomes stronger as closer to shore you get in terms of like armor cladding and so forth. In many instances, the cable is buried for protection purposes closer to shore. I think there's been a lot of discussion in the Baltic context about the possibility of burying cables, but there are a lot of other issues to consider in terms of, cost, evidently, and who would carry that cost, probably industry, but then that would then be the consumer that would carry the ultimate cost. But there are also a range of other issues, environmental and so forth, in terms of cable burial.
But essentially, it's a very small and also fragile thing, like the garden hose that you mentioned in a vast ocean, yes, basically.
But they are very resilient. Kudos to industry because they have been built with a lot of resilience in mind. Redundancy options that exist generally have worked very well. All of the incidents that have been mentioned in the Baltics in particular, there has been a redundancy has worked generally, and the service outage has been minimal. There has been higher latency and some slowing down in some contexts, but in general, it's been quite positive. So I think in general, for the conditions, peacetime conditions, I think the systems are really quite resilient.
So the main danger that is a bit implied in the way you phrased it is in peacetime conditions. The main danger is not wear and tear. The main danger is not maybe natural causes. It is indeed some kind of man-made, probably also purposeful damaging of the infrastructure. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. And maybe Jonas, you can come in here again as well. But first of all, climate. A lot of climate events, unexpected climate events that we're facing, and critical dependencies, codependencies across other critical systems. So if something happens in the energy sector, the cascading effects across into telecommunications and data and technology and so forth are, I guess, unknown. The effects are unknown. And I think every time there is an event, we're discovering more issues. And then, yes, we have the unexpected, man-made, intentional activity that governments are concerned about, at least in the European transatlantic context at the moment. Jonas?
I think the last category of incidents that you mentioned doesn't have to be open war or an open conflict. It can also be a sabotage that is by a very knowledgeable actor, coordinated on multiple locations at once or in close time relation to overwhelm the repair capacity. So it doesn't have to be an open conflict setting. But if you look at Central Europe or Western Europe or continental Europe, there's also much redundancy when it comes to terrestrial cross-border connections. So, for example, the Baltic Sea, it's an encircled sea. So there's most of the countries, of the adjacent countries, are also connected with their bordering nations. Russia is the only exception there, even though there are still land fiber-optic lines between Finland and Russia and also on the Baltics and Russia. But I'm not sure if they're working at the moment and used for routing traffic. So this is also something that has to be borne in mind, that even though there is the scenario of an open conflict or a very coordinated sabotage, it would take many simultaneous parallel points of action, which would be, I think, very quickly recognized by governments, and responses would be taken then.
And I think, again, it depends where you're geographically located and the dependencies that you have, the redundancy options that you have via cables, but also through alternative redundancy means. And that could be satellite, it could be tier 1 data centers, at least to keep compute power going for some time. So there's a range of different options that states are looking at in conjunction with industry. That makes me at least sleep better at night in terms of this current phase that we're living through in terms of uncertainty and so forth.
Yeah. So redundancy is key then. Let me ask you, maybe different in different parts of the world, but who's usually responsible for putting these cables there and running them? Is that entirely in the hand of private enterprises, or are they also state-run, or are they kind of mixed models?
Mixed. Jonas, go ahead.
Well, there are different types of how to finance a cable and how to own a cable. So what we see now for the cables that are constructed and planned at the moment, it's mostly content providers that own them by themselves or as part of a consortia in which they hold the largest share. But content providers as large companies, we're talking about Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, that host cloud services and have huge chunks of the whole internet traffic. For them, paying for a subsea cable is just something that they do quite easily because they have very deep pockets, to say the least. And there's this, let's say, more traditional type of ownership, on the other hand, which would be telco companies getting together in a consortium saying, well, we have a business case that we all profit from, and we share different parts of bandwidth of the cable. If it's a more complex system, it can also be that they only share parts of sections of a cable. These are the two types how a cable can be owned, but there are also other types of financing and co-financing from states. So there can be the model of development banks that say want to connect a territory with which they want to have a better diplomatic relation, some kind of a cable diplomacy approach. There can also be a direct funding. For example, the European Union does it through their cable projects of European interest, in which they just assign through different requirements cable systems that can get a co-funding or are eligible for a co-funding. And then there are also military systems. So what is openly known is that the US Navy also owns tens of thousands of kilometers of subsea cable, and they also own a cable laying vessel. So you have a broad array of how states can also influence the cable market. But to say military systems would not work as cables that carry on public internet traffic, but very specifically communications for military.
Yeah, I assume, and especially in times of crisis, the military is probably even less likely or less inclined to opening those networks to civilian purposes. Okay, so we have a very varied picture, I understand, both in terms of how these cables operate, who owns them, who runs them, how many of their cables there are, how much resilience there is. Our podcast is called Business Diplomacy Today. So what we do is we look at these geopolitical issues, such as the one that we're talking today, from a business perspective. Now, if I'm a business leader, an executive somewhere, and I listen to this, what does it mean for me? Is that something that I'll just take as granted, hope that everything works, internet connections will always be stable to wherever I need them to? Is there something I can prepare for as an individual company? How do you see that? Should that be part of the risk scenario that a company prepares for?
I think it depends on what type of company. We can come back to that, but I do think there's a very strong role for business to play in this regard, and also identifying and understanding the process, the criticality processes in government, and understanding how governments approach identifying and designating specific infrastructures and services as critical or essential to the functioning and well-being of society. I do think of many businesses, especially big businesses, would be interested in understanding that that business continuity is guaranteed. And if there is disruption, there would be definitely an interest in understanding what redundancy options and so forth are there. But yeah, it depends very much which business you're in. And I think it becomes more complicated for medium and smaller businesses in terms of the voice that they can have in shaping all of these different policies and determinations. Within business itself, I think there are different ways of interjecting and participating, including through or liaising with some of the industry associations like the International Cable Protection Committee, the European Subsea Cable Association. There's another one in Europe, I can't remember the acronym for it. There's the Danish Cable Protection Committee. There's a Norwegian one that's been recently established. So the cable owners and operators do have very well-functioning and regular meetings to, I guess, update themselves on things that are happening within the industry, but also liaising increasingly with governments and more governments participating as observers. But I don't see why there shouldn't be more liaising across businesses as well. There's evidently strong liaising with the fishers and the fishing industry and with the shipping industry and with oil and gas as well, because of sharing the seabed and so forth. But other businesses, I guess the one that comes prominently to mind is the financial services sectors. And I do know that they have been, I think the financial services, ISAC in the US, for example, recently conducted a study on subsea cables and so forth, identifying some of the challenges that are of relevance to the financial services. Just one last point before Jonas comes in. The parliamentary hearings that were held recently in the UK, they also invited other sectors to interject, including the financial services sector. And I fully recommend listening or viewing that specific session. It was quite interesting.
Yes, I really don't have much to add. It was very comprehensive. I think if you're a business that's conducting its business over services like Facebook, for example, it can also be interesting to liaise with the content providers. If you're a shop that's running on Amazon, it's also interesting would be interesting to see how they secure their connectivity, because they're trying to build a somewhat separate network with its own protocols and its own prioritization of traffic. I would also say small and medium enterprise are probably not that much in a position to actually shape the network. But larger companies with huge hunger for data and data connectivity, and also I think those make also up large parts of the client base, can have a power and a say in what redundancy and resilience for cables could look like, and could also liaise with the industry, their connectivity providers on that topic as well.
At the same time, I think the small and medium-sized enterprises, evidently, they do have an important stake in terms of network resilience being assured. I think academia can play a really good role in trying to push forward and identifying some of the business costs of service outages and so forth. I think it's easier when it's a smaller country or an island country like Tonga, or some of the Matsu Islands in the South China Sea have also been affected, and their businesses evidently are disrupted in Shetlands as well. But in terms of the service outages that were detected following the incidents in the Baltics, for example, trying to understand that, which I think will have an effect on both domestic law in terms of identifying the effects, and for cases of negligence and so forth that may be tried in local courts, etc. I think the recent case that was tried at a district court in Finland is interesting to read in that regard. In the end, the court determined that it didn't have the jurisdiction to try the case, but there are lots of really interesting detail there, including in relation to effects of the incident in Finland itself.
Because it happened in international waters. Was that the reason, or?
Yeah, it was the jurisdiction that hit back in the end.
Do you think there is a need for increased regulation, either in this respect, but also when it comes to requiring companies to adhere to certain standards when it comes to protection, resilience, etc., given the fact that the financial ripple effects can be so severe if there is a significant disruption? Is there something that you would say is under-regulated at the moment?
Okay, so if you look at the EU regulation and the recent NIS2 directive, the cybersecurity directive, the Critical Entities Resilience Act, the updated maritime strategy, it's more of a strategy, so not regulation, but you also have the electronic communications networks. And there's a whole slew of EU regulation that is now being transposed into national legislation. And I think, so yes, there are more requirements, regulatory requirements coming down the line for companies, and there's a lot of discussion at national level. There are also a lot of new regulations in different contexts related to maritime spatial planning and other issues related to permitting and licensing that also have environmental elements that companies are dealing with at the moment. So I think one of the big questions is streamlining and clarity and predictability and so forth, which are key issues that industry actors are pushing from governments. And if you look at the EU recommendation on subsea cable security and resilience and the action plan, the cable security action plan that came out in February this year, you'll see that predictability is something that the EU itself is trying to push. It's very complicated. We know that we are working with a very big machine, but I do think there is some action happening in specific member states that are kind of key in the EU context. Before I hand over to Jonas, over in the US, you'll see a lot of activity, new rules coming from the Federal Communications Commission, also in relation to cybersecurity supply chain issues, and very much focused on the competition with China, but ensuring that networks and equipment that touches in any way on the US and US connectivity elsewhere is also being targeted through new rules and regulations.
Anything you'd like to add, Jonas?
Yeah. I think it's also very context specific on what the government over or government under reach would be. So if you look at parts of Southern Africa or also South Pacific island nations, for them, connectivity is just a goal to be able to develop yourselves into an economy that's internet driven, where you can have remote work. And there, sometimes too much regulation would see as a factor that distracts business. So cables would not be laid if there's too much regulation. For example, Germany is sometimes mentioned as a case for, quite lengthy bureaucratic regulation regimes. And it's just then shifting to other countries like the Netherlands or France, where it's much easier to get a licensing and permitting for your cable. And then the traffic is just transmitted to Germany via land. there can be differences if you want to or must attract cables, especially if you're an island nation, or if you can also live with getting it cross-border and you trust your neighbors. And this is just something that a state has to think of for itself if it wants to make itself dependent on specific nations, its neighbors, or if it wants to make itself dependent on specific cable suppliers. That's another question that then comes into play for countries that want to develop themselves, and if they want to have a cheap option for a cable, it's often also a Chinese supplier that's doing the cheapest bid and is often also chosen by island nations or developing nations.
Okay. Which then again, at least from a European perspective, opens up a whole new other area, where the question is whether it's wise to rely on one particular country for a lot of the components of critical infrastructure. Camino.
Okay, so basically, we're at a moment where security requirements can slow down certain operations, at a moment where we need to be nimble, or industry needs to be nimble. I think this is particularly the case where operations and maintenance is concerned regarding subsea cables. And they're trying to reach a balance, I think, is really key. And that's something that governments, I think, are struggling with at the moment. And how also, I think, from a cybersecurity perspective, how you also meet some of the requirements while also being able to adapt to changing circumstances. These are concerns that I think are happening across sectors, especially those working that have a maritime and a terrestrial component, but are also very dependent on resilient cybersecurity systems.
Executive briefing. What you should read now.
Executive briefing is one of the fixed segments in our show where we ask our guests to provide some further readings or some other sources that our listeners can go to if they want to learn more about the subject that we're discussing. And obviously, I'll start with the first one because the two of you have written a paper, which we will also link in the show notes. It was mentioned already in the conversation. It's called Achieving Depth, Subsea Telecommunications Cables as Critical Infrastructure. I definitely recommend you have a look into that if you're interested in more details. It's also available for free on the internet, and we'll provide a link to that in our show notes. But I wanted to ask you, Jonas and Camino, in addition to that paper, is there anything else you would like to recommend to our listeners?
So I think one of the seminal books on subsea cable systems is The Undersea Network by Nicole Staroselski. It's a kind of ethnographic study on the build-up of cables in the Pacific region. It touches on many topics, the social embeddedness of the systems, also how commercial decisions are being made. And I think although the book is already 10 years old, it's been published in 2015, I think it's very rich in its contents, and it also offers multiple perspectives on how infrastructures can be used to connect, but are also sometimes a force to disconnect populations. So that's my first recommendations for the people that want to look more at the sociological or ethnographic or anthropologic side of things. On the technical side, I think there's a great book that's been recently updated to its 3rd edition by José Chesnoy, Undersea Fiber Communication Systems. It's like the engineering Bible of subsea cable systems. It requires also a baseline knowledge of engineering to read these chapters, but if you read it, it's quite accessible and it's also very comprehensive in its technical detail. So if you're more interested in the technical side of things, I'd definitely go for Undersea Fiber Communication Systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Camino, you would like to add something?
No, beyond the reports and books that Jonas has just mentioned, I would recommend one that has nothing to do with cables, but I think is really relevant for the moment that we're living through. And it's called How to Survive a Crisis, Lessons in Resilience and Avoiding Disaster by Sir David Omand, the former director of GCHQ.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We'll put all those titles in the show notes so that our listeners can go there and have a look.
A bold prediction. The world in 10 years.
That is another fixed segment in our show, and there we ask our guests to take out the proverbial crystal ball and let us know how they think the situation will look like in 10 years from now when it comes to the topic that we've been discussing here in this episode. So what's your take on subsea cables and critical infrastructure in 10 years? Where will we be there?
Jonas, you start.
Well, I have a very specific, bold prediction that within 10 years, the last continent, Antarctica, will be connected to the fiber optic system. So Antarctica is a very specific case because there's no real client base apart from during Antarctic summer, about 4,000 researchers that are also somewhat used to not being as connected as they usually are when they're back home. It's a rough environment. There's much at play. Ice core that raises the ocean floor. But there are also two projects that are in different stages of planning. We'll see how they play out. One is dependent on National Science Foundation funding from the US, and the other one is mostly pursued by Chile. It's not so relevant for businesses. It's more of a symbolic value, but that's also how geopolitics is often made, through symbols and through action that is just visibly seen. And it's just something that nations can gain from, and we'll see who will be the first nation to land a cable in Antarctica. Also, there's a small business to be made because Antarctic tourism could profit from a connection to Antarctica. So that's a very specific, bold prediction. But if you look at how long it's been in the planning and how many projects were being thought of on the Antarctic cable connection, it still falls into bold.
Great. We'll see. Maybe we'll have to come back to that in 10 years' time and see what happened. Camino, what's your bold prediction?
Usually I'm much more optimistic, but given everything that's happening at the moment, I do think that subsea cables become even more central to competition between states. And if indeed something happens as is being suggested by EU leadership and so forth, I think the industry is in for a rough ride. And I am hoping that both governments and industry will manage this in an appropriate manner, but it's difficult to see at the moment. It's not a clear prediction. It's just very difficult to see where things are going to land, given the current situation and given the rhetoric from different parts of the world at the moment. And I think the biggest challenge is our neighbours across the Atlantic and trying to understand how the situation there will pan out and being able to work together in the future.
Thank you. Subsea cables, an incredibly important part of our critical infrastructure, something that we don't usually see, that we take for granted until something happens that disrupts the flow of information, the flow of data. Something that will become even more important as data streams continue to increase. Jonas, Camino, thank you very much for introducing us to this important topic, also from a business perspective. We will certainly monitor and watch the situation as it unfolds. And I think there is definitely space for an update, not just in 10 years' time when we will have to find out whether there's actually internet connection, sea-based internet connection to Antarctica. Thank you very much for joining me today. This was another episode of the Business Diplomacy Today podcast. This podcast is presented by the German Maritime Centre. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, we would also be delighted if you would leave a review or a rating there. You can also go to our website at businessdiplomacy.today to check out the show notes of this episode. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.